Thanks for joining us. I have been working on applications since competitive applications since 2010, and I am super excited about today's topics. We're going to do things a little differently today. We're going to start spending about 5 or 10 minutes talking a little bit about updates as to what's happening with the application. We're going to have a quick Q&A session with folks who are experienced with the application, who know what's going on, who have either purchased the application accelerator or a little more familiar with the process in Illinois. So starting off, there's a new application. The state of Illinois put it up on their website and they said in parentheses update, but they didn't really tell anyone. And so we wanted to make sure everybody's working from the right application materials. It's the same link and the same URL on the state's website. You just go back to the Department of Agriculture's page and you need to download those materials. There's not a lot of substantial changes. It's mostly like fixing typos. There are 2 big changes. This is related to craft grow, is what we're going to talk about right this second. The new application for craft grow, Exhibit A, has some changes, which is the page limit has been lifted, which is wonderful, especially for people who are doing craft grow plus extraction, because it gives you a little bit more wiggle room and space to talk about the technical distinctions between cultivation and extraction. The application accelerator materials that you'll receive for craft grow with extraction, which we've called craft grow plus, those materials are coming out soon and they will be longer than the 50 pages, which was originally the limit. So it's very exciting. Exhibit M, that's really where the major change was. Previously, Exhibit M it gave you 2 categories of topics and you got 10 pages for each topic. Now they've combined it. There's no categories for Exhibit M and you only have 10 pages. That's about it for updates for our existing experienced clients. I'd like to open up the floor for questions, not 101 basic questions because we're going to get into that, but if anybody has any questions about a specific issue that they're running into with submission or developing their materials, please stick it in the chat box. If not, we are going to move on into our Intro 101 session, and the next webinar we move to will be back to a little bit more technical detail and going in deep with the application materials. And I'm excited to keep going with the 101 folks. I want to introduce you to our CEO, Zeta. Hi, thanks for joining us, Zeta.
Yes. That was a really good explanation of what you just went through. That was fantastic. And I guess we're moving on to how GRC is amending the accelerator application or the accelerator products to fit everything that you just mentioned. Do you want to kind of go into some of that right now and just see how we're going to update that section? Or
yeah, I mean, for Exhibit M, we're going to shorten it by quite a bit, by 50%. We're also going to throw in some more topics since the categories are no longer limited. So that's really exciting.
Excellent. Well, then I think, I guess we could just dive into basics and talk a little bit about licensing and outline basic, about the laws and rules and regulations.
That sounds great.
Maybe we could start there. You want to go ahead and kick it off for that section?
Sure. For those of you who are super new to this, there are laws that say that you can operate a commercial cannabis business in the state of Illinois. There are also rules, or they're also called regulations. And the state, basically with the laws that they promulgated, they were like, hey, we want to do this program. Department of Agriculture set up the program, get licenses going. And then the Department of Agriculture and the other agencies involved got together and wrote some emergency rules. And those are the regulations that we're following, or that we need to follow in this process. There will be more regulations coming. The current emergency regulations are pretty limited. Within this whole program, there's an application process. In order to participate in the commercial cannabis industry in Illinois, you have to have a license. And there are several different types of licenses, and we'll get into that in a second. But I also wanted to let you guys know, just sort of flag this for you. You have to follow all the laws. that are related to cannabis. But as a company, you're also required to follow all the laws of retail facilities or agricultural facilities that exist in the state of Illinois, in the city or county you're operating in, as well as in the US. So you're still beholden to things like HR rules under the federal government and OSHA. You still have to report taxes and do all of those other things. So what we're going to talk about today is just the cannabis specific stuff, but please keep in mind that there's a lot more as a business owner that you have to participate in. Shall I go into the types of licenses?
Yes.
All right. So in Illinois, there are basically 4 types of licenses available. Now, dispensary is the storefront retail that we're used to. It's a competitive license. There were limited available. The application rounds closed on January 2nd, but there's going to be another round. We just don't know exactly when that will happen. It'll probably be in the next 8 to 10 months, I think. It may be shorter. Keep an eye on your email because Green Rush Consulting will be emailing our email list. So if you're not on that, let's get you signed up. Let us know. And we'll let you know when the dispensary licenses, the next wave is released.
Didn't they say something about like it being December of this year, maybe? I think I saw something along those lines. So it's potentially, like you said, 8 to 10 months at best, but we never know. I mean, they could.
Yeah, you know what's interesting is that I have seen that language tossed around about December, but what's interesting is it's not published on any of the agency's websites, which makes me think it might be a little bit of a
It's always a moving target. I mean, you never know when it's going to land. Sometimes they delay it. Sometimes they're on time. Sometimes they could be early. But typically, typically it's either on time or delayed, right? So.
Those are the options.
Yeah.
All right, moving on to the ones that are actually available. These 3 types are available right now. 2 of them are competitive. And we'll talk about them. So the first is craft grow. Oh, you know what? I also want to mention, we're going to talk about some license types that are available. There are license types that are not currently available, that don't exist yet, but they're going to. The state has said that there's going to be a cultivation license, cultivation organization license. They've only had that for medical in the past. And so we're talking about adult use today. I wanted to clarify that. So that's recreational. So they're going to release these license types and they're going to be different than what we're talking about today. So there's going to be even more opportunities to participate in the market. So right now available are craft grow, infuser, and transportation. Craft grow is a cultivation facility. You can't go over 5,000 square feet of canopy, and that counts canopy that's stacked. So if you use double stacking tables, then you only get 2,500 square feet in essence, because, you know, the stacking. That license, there's going to be 40 of for the whole state. 40 adult use licenses, so it's highly competitive, and that license application is due March 16th. Again, there's going to be another round of this, but we don't know the exact timing. There will be more licenses released in the future, but for right now, there are 40 available, and the applications are due March 16th, which is very soon. There's an infuser license, which is, craft grow, you're also allowed to extract. You can extract. You can't infuse, but you can extract from the cannabis plant. Now, the infuser license, infusers can also extract and infuse. So they can take it out of the cannabis product and then put it into things like edibles or tinctures. The infuser licenses are also very competitive. There are only 40 available as well. They're due March 16th. There is another license type that's really exciting called transportation. It's not a competitive license. It's a compliance-based license, which means that basically if you're compliant, you get the license. The state said that as long as you get 75% of all points available on the application process, that you'll get your license. Now that application is also due March 16th. Because it's not competitive, it's a really great entry point for people who want to start small and get a foothold in the industry, see what's going on, and then move on.
Can we jump into some of that a little bit more? I had some questions too as well. Like, for instance, like transportation, for instance, we're seeing a lot of groups that, are either applying for a craft grower or infuser license or both, that couple transportation with it, and so they can deliver their own products, right? But also deliver other products throughout the state too as well. So it's just really about how much you want to scale, but being able to control that distribution and the cost of that distribution seems like key, doesn't it, LP?
Absolutely, yeah. You're allowed to have multiple licenses. You can't have 2 craft grow, but you can have a craft grow and an infuser and a transportation and a dispensary or retail license. You can stock them, kind of do everything you want, but you don't have to. If you wanted to just stick with one license, you can. It's really a business decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have a background in transportation and logistics, or you work for a company or drive a truck, or have, a group of folks that drive trucks, I think that is a really good fit for transportation. And, I can agree with you that a lot of folks have asked us about this particular license, and it does seem like it's compliance based and really serving the state and serving the distribution of the state. So that's really cool. It's a really cool opportunity. I think also, I wanted just a quick clarification on the craft grower extraction aspect. I know we're getting a lot of questions about that too as well. It's kind of funny because the state released FAQs that stated that it's almost in conflict with the rules too as well. I mean, can you go into just a little bit of that so we can get some clarification?
Yeah, it was really confusing. The state released some Q&As where they were like, yeah, infusers and craft grow facilities can do whatever they want, but the rules are pretty limited. There's a pretty decent chance that the rules are going to change. So what we're talking about now, what you're allowed to do with your license now, may change. Craft growers may actually be allowed to extract and infuse in the future. That may change even before they issue this round of licenses. But as far as the application process is what we're doing right now and helping you get through that first hurdle, we have to assume that you can't extract if you're a craft grower unless you have, or excuse me, that you can extract, but you cannot infuse unless you also get that infuser license.
And since we're on the subject of infusing under a craft grow license, currently right now we don't see it, sort of being allowed. Can they fill vaporizer cartridges under the craft grow license? That's another question we're getting to a lot as well. Or is it that specifically for infusion, and is putting, or filling and refilling vaporizer cartridges considered under the infusion license only?
Yeah, that's a really good question that we had too, and we asked the state, and they didn't really tell us, but they kind of said you can. So we're moving forward with the assumption, based on what they've said about filling cartridges specifically, that you can. As a craft grower, you can fill cartridges because it's not actually infusion, based on some of the information the state has provided.
And then I had one more on this one too. I know these are some really tough questions, but I think it's really important that we answer these questions as best as we can, working with the state and working with the knowledge that we have at hand. But we have had some inquiries so if the state released this answer, the questions, and stated that yes, craft grower can do infusion and extraction. There's some folks that are saying, well, I'm going to, bet my chances right now because I don't want to lose out on not being able to do infusion if they allow it. Do you think that's an appropriate path or strategy?
I mean, it's
dock points, on the application too as well. I mean, there's some really critical questions. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a valid way to move forward. I'm really the is it legal person. As far as the business side, if it's legal, then yeah, sure, go for it. I think it's a great idea.
Sure. Because we see these anomalies all the time where states either conflict themselves with the information they're releasing to the public in FAQs that conflict with the state regulations. And maybe it's because someone there is not educated enough or trained enough to understand that it's happening so fast, right?
Absolutely.
I wonder, one of the things they were mentioned, or one of the things that was mentioned was okay, well, if I go for this, what is the worst possible thing that can happen? Will my application get disqualified? Will it dock points? Or am I missing out on an opportunity right now because I didn't submit this information under my craft grower application? It's really interesting to hear some of these aspects, right? So I think that's really important. And then coming over to infuser really quickly, so the infuser can just accept wholesale distillate, or can they extract too as well?
They can extract as well.
Okay.
Infusers can extract craft growers can extract.
Okay, good. So we just want to make sure that's clear, because we get a lot of confusing and conflicting information, on this matter, but we just want to make sure it's clear and make sure everyone is creating their application in a very compliant manner that has the least amount of risk, right? And so, I mean, at the end of the day too, if you submit this information, you're going to have to do it, just like the state will enforce that, so you have to follow everything. It is a legal document. So
yeah, I wanted to jump in and comment on something that you had said a minute ago. Like, what's the risk? What's the risk of including the wrong information? What's the risk of doing it this way or that way? And I wanted to sort of give some context. The state of Illinois has been so far pretty lenient. There are very few things that they have said are disqualifying. So even if you don't include basic required information, the state has said that they may give you 10 days to fix it. Oh, yeah. So this state has been a lot more flexible than other jurisdictions we're used to working with. So the risk is a little bit lower. They could still disqualify you, but yeah, they've been great. Right.
I mean, especially since 2014. 2014 had a really, really strong process, but it was one of the first processes. So they've come a long way in getting this, up to speed. So let's move on. Let's talk about building a team. I think that's really always super critical when you're obviously starting a new business like this. You want to surround yourself with the best team and the best experts. But specifically for the application, why don't you discuss a little bit with the audience about, how to build a team and talking about principal officers and things like that.
Absolutely. I also wanted to let you all know that I linked in the chat. If you click on the chat box that's at the bottom of your screen, I linked to the updated craft grower application in case you needed to see that. As far as building a team is concerned, with respect to building the strongest team for what the state cares about and getting your license, principal officers is a phrase that has a meaning more in corporate America. We need to forget that meaning because the state of Illinois has redefined it. And a principal officer in this context is somebody that sort of has the ability to change the direction of things that are happening in your company. They've been very vague as to what a principal officer is, which is actually good, and I'm going to explain why. Principal officers are the only people that you can talk about. So when you apply for a license, I guess I should have started with this. When you apply for these licenses, you have to show the state hey, we know what we're doing. We have a great team. We have money. We have a solid business plan. We have a property. And it's a complex and challenging process, but you guys can do it. I know you can, especially with our help. And one of the best ways that you can prove to the state that you can do this is to build a team of experts and experienced people. Not everybody needs to have cannabis experience. They can be people from all walks of life, and you can explain how they're going to participate in your company and make it a more successful enterprise. So principal officers are important. It's good that their definition is vague because you can only talk about principal officers in your application. You can't just say they're going to be my employee, but they're not a principal officer. If that's the case, you can't talk about their skills and their experience, their resume, things like that. So it's actually great that you can talk about anybody. You can make anybody your principal officer that you want. As you're building out your company, you're going to have an organizational chart or an org chart you'll hear people talk about, and it's kind of the layout of how everybody interacts with each other. And that includes things like owners. You may want to have an advisory board where they don't actually work for the company, but you can call them and ask them for help, either building your standard operating procedures or other business advice. So you can have owners, advisory board members. You can also have employees, obviously, that's the big one. You can also have a financial person or group or people that are just investors that maybe aren't actually owners because they're not participating in the labor of everything. They're just putting up money. In that instance, lending you money, not taking a percentage of the company. So those are some of the types of people that you might want to talk about in your application. You don't have to identify everyone on your org chart. You don't have to know who's going to play those roles, but the more that you have those people already named, the better it is, because you can talk about their skills and experience. You get to submit their resume plus their bio to the state and show how awesome each of those people is.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then with principal officers, let's just say, I have a scenario where I have a cultivation director, and that cultivation director does not own any equity in the company at all. But they have obviously a managing control over the operations, and that would be considered a principal officer, correct?
Correct.
Okay, good. Okay, so that's where you can, separate those two, and really, like, you don't necessarily need to have someone with equity. You can actually have someone just come into the organization, be listed as a principal officer, but they still are under the definition of a principal officer through management control. And that's another, a question that we get a lot too as well.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I think that, going from the team, right? And then we also have like the location. I know that location is always a critical element, in a lot of this, because you can extrapolate a lot of information out of it. I mean, we know what the community looks like. We can lay out the facility. We know how and the methodologies in which we're going to grow, what our traffic, impact assessment and environmental impact assessment is. Tell us a little bit about location and identifying locations, since it seems like it's a requirement this round.
Absolutely. Identifying a location can be really complex. There is a very big piece of this, which is local approval. Illinois requires you, everywhere requires you, but really Illinois requires you to have the local okay to operate in that particular location, and to be participating in cannabis. And every city or county has their own rules as to how to properly operate and what they're going to require from you. But yeah, finding a city or a jurisdiction that's willing to play ball is clutch. Other things that are important with respect to location are, and the state doesn't actually have any other requirements as far as like zoning or location. Besides, there are some very basic distance requirements. You can't be super close to certain license types or sensitive uses, but generally speaking, the state doesn't really have a whole lot of say. The only thing that they care about really is that the locals are happy with the situation. So you're really going to want to work with your local government to find out what we refer to as green zones. What are the areas within the city or county that you're allowed to operate a commercial cannabis company? Sometimes the cities have very strict rules, and they say retail has to be over here and cultivation has to be over here. And if you want to get both license types, that means your company is separated. Local rules can change. So we strongly recommend civic engagement. If you are considering participating in this industry and you know what city or county you want to operate in, the first thing I would recommend you do before you even start talking to your partners or figuring that out is go make friends with some folks in the zoning department of that city or county, because they're going to be your best friends and they will go to bat for you if they like your mission and your vision and your values. And then the other things to consider with respect to location, Illinois actually requires that all owners of property that host a commercial cannabis company know and are cool with it being a commercial cannabis company. So that includes your landlord. Your landlord has to know what you're doing. You can't pretend like you're a flower shop. Even if, we're growing flower, you have to say this is cannabis, and your landlord has to sign a form that says, yes, I know that it's cannabis. The complicated part is that if the property has other owners or other companies or people with interest in that property, all of those other people also have to sign that form, which can get complicated if your main owner of your property, he's got a building in a great location, it's in the green zone, he's willing to work with you, but his brother owns 10% of the property. His brother's got to sign that form too. And then the really complicating factor is if there's a mortgage on the property and the bank, there's a loan involved and the bank is participating, the bank also has to sign a letter saying that they understand that it's going to be cannabis and that they're okay with that. And banks can be pretty hostile. I include this much detail talking about property because I really want you to know that you need to tell your realtor about this. If you work with a realtor in cannabis, they're going to be familiar with this. But if you work with someone who's not in this industry, they will not recognize that, and they need to be upfront when they start talking to people, because you don't want to go get halfway through the process of putting down an offer or making it a relationship, spend all of that time, and then find out that it's not going to be okay.
We had a quick question, from one of the audience members is what if the building is owned by an LLC? Do all partners need to sign off, for approval?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I thought so
the
too.
short answer is probably yes. The LLC, it depends, honestly, it depends on how the LLC is organized and how they get to make decisions. Technically, you need approval from the LLC, like the company or the agency. You don't necessarily need every single person, but yeah, it depends on how they're organized. If their operating agreement, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, if their operating agreement says that their CEO gets to make decisions willy-nilly without input from anyone else, then you're fine, because he's the one who can sign the form, and it's great. But yeah, there's no requirement that each owner of the LLC sign it, as long as the LLC is the only owner of that property. Sometimes the way it's set up, the owners of the LLC will also have pieces of that property as well, like individually. So really, yeah, have some lawyers look at their operating agreement.
Right, and
Great
I want to reflect a little bit back on what you said earlier about properties that have a bank note on it or a loan on it. I mean, typically you typically are not successful in that due to whatever the bank's loan is on it, and because it's a federally illegal substance. We've seen that just not really work out most of the time. And then coming back to the other objection that we usually run into, or that you'll probably have already run into or seen, is asset forfeiture. Right. And, and that is a big threat to the building owners or property owners' asset. However, we don't, as long as you're following within compliance, within state compliance, I mean, typically we don't really see that being an issue. I haven't really seen that being an issue in quite some time. Maybe back earlier in the industry's early years, but now it's kind of becoming more common. And so but again, being in other, states that aren't used to this or haven't gone through this process, there's still a lot of education out there that needs to be done for some of these folks.
Yeah, related to asset forfeiture, I just wanted to flag one thing. You're right, we haven't seen a lot of asset forfeiture happen in the past, I'd say 5 years or so, maybe a little longer. The one time that it does pop up is where either the city or the county or the cops where you're located get upset about what's happening, and then they target your landlord and say, hey, landlord, your lessee is operating an illegal business under federal law, and we're going to send the DEA, or we're going to send the ATF, or we're going to send the IRS, and they're going to seize your asset and you'll never get your property back. And you know what? That's totally legal for them to do that, and it's awful. So it's really, that's another reason to get civically engaged as soon as you can, so that everybody's happy with what's happening and your landlord's not going to get threatened with that particular stick, I guess.
100%. And I really appreciate you saying that, LP. I mean, it's very, very true. I mean, it's still federally illegal, and it's still legal for them to do these things. So we always have to keep that in mind, even though it's becoming more and more accepted, across the board, and people are becoming educated and more aware. One more thing on locations and property, regarding zoning, or specifically Exhibit O. And if you are in a city or municipality or county that hasn't created any zoning laws yet, it looks like there was a few options on Exhibit O where it says, either you're in compliance with the current zoning laws, or the city's creating new zoning laws, or there are no zoning laws yet, but we got a letter from the city. Now, tell us a little bit about those three options. Obviously, the best option is you're already in compliance with zoning laws and they've already created a set of zoning laws. But let's talk a little bit about the other two in specific and how it impacts the application, and what are ways of really mitigating that by getting a letter from the city saying, hey, we're creating some zoning laws, and currently right now this is where the status is. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Definitely. So for that exhibit, the only thing you need is that form signed. And the form has some check boxes for the local jurisdiction, and the local jurisdiction gets to kind of decide how they're going to respond to those questions. The state issued a question and answer about how the cities, like what the city should do or the county should do. So I strongly recommend if you're going through this process and you're working with your locals, I would bring that Q&A to them, because it tells them exactly how they need to respond and what matters and what doesn't. I don't think, from what the state has said, it doesn't matter if the city isn't yet like licensing anybody or doesn't have a permitting process. It doesn't seem like the state has any preference for which type the situation is, which is your city has no zoning laws. Your city has some zoning laws, but they don't have an application process, but you're going to participate in it when they do, or they already have a process and either you've participated in it and won, or you're waiting for a result. And so those are the three types, and it doesn't seem like the state cares about which of those three, as long as the city fills it out properly, which they may not do. So you got to be careful and make sure they understand what they're signing and how.
Right.
And then also you submit it. That's why I say bring the Q&A, because the cities, they're not used to dealing with us in new jurisdictions. If they haven't had medical, then they don't know about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the fact that like cities will have their own process for you to get that signed notice, proper notice zoning form. And, I've seen, somewhere they have go through almost like a CUP process for that. And that takes time, right? And we've seen situations where, an applicant, was going through that process while they had to submit their state application and try to get that, that bridge into it, waiting on that zoning approval, right? So it is a little bit of more of a complicated process than you think to get that zoning form sometimes, depending on what city you're in. And again, this reflects back to what LP just mentioned earlier about building rapport with the civic engagement and the city officials and the city themselves, so you get better understanding of their process, you're on their radar, and just building that support structure around it to just receive this one approval on this document, whether it's any one of those options. So I thought that was pretty interesting to bring up. So do you want to move on to like capital, and talking a little bit more about the financial requirements and, what's needed here to operate any one of these licenses?
Absolutely. Sure. That sounds good. Capital is important. We live in, you have to have money to operate. It's an expensive industry because of all of the licensing requirements and other hoops that you have to jump through. The state of Illinois has a very low threshold as far as liquid capital, which is great. It's still a lot of money, $20,000 liquid. You have to prove that you have $20,000 liquid, and usually liquid means that there's no lag time in getting access to it. You don't have to sell stocks and bonds. It also, liquid capital usually also means that the value of that capital doesn't fluctuate. So again, stocks and bonds come to mind because they do fluctuate and you don't know exactly how much it's worth. It may be worth $25,000 right now, and then in 3 days it may only be worth $15,000. And so they really want that liquid capital for $20,000. But that's just the bare minimum that you need to show. And that $20,000 could be a line of credit. They treat that as liquid capital, as long as you've gone through all the processes and the bank has given you the actual line of credit and says, yes, today you could withdraw up to $20,000 on this line of credit, then that counts as well. Other money, you need more than $20,000. The state requires that you be able to get up and running, pay all of your vendors, train your new employees, do everything that it takes, get the city on board, including any licensing processes they have or permitting processes, not just for cannabis, but you have to get your occupancy permit and all of those other things. You have to be able to get all the way through opening your doors without making any more money or taking on any more investments. The reality is that if you have one of these licenses and you win, you compete and you win, you're going to be able to get more investors, but the state doesn't like to consider that. It's frustrating. So they look at what you currently have, and you have to be able to currently do that. Now, outside of the $20,000 liquid, the capital that you show can be other things. It can be property, it can be stocks and bonds, it can be your partnership, your interest in a particular company. Things like that can be for the other money, but you need a lot. And everything that you tell the state you're going to do, you better show them that you have that money available.
And disclosure of all the sources that where that funding is coming from. They're going to dig deep into that area to understand that it's, obviously clean money and it's coming from good sources. And so, when showing that, I mean, LP, is it just like a snapshot of a bank account for that asset? Is it, a certified CPA letter? I mean, how would you show that, typically if it's just you're holding on to cash, not necessarily a letter of credit?
So if you're holding on to cash, actually the state of Illinois doesn't require you to show the source of your capital.
Oh, it doesn't? Because I thought.
No, which is lovely. You have to show that you have it. And if it belongs to somebody who's an owner or an investor or a lender, you have to make that connection. They have to make that promise. So they show their bank account and they write a letter that says, I intend to dedicate this amount of this bank account to this project. And it's unencumbered, meaning it's not dedicated to anything else. So if you're applying for 3 licenses, you can't use the same money for all 3 licenses. It's got to be different chunks of funds. But the state does not require you to show, at least at this point in the process. They may do investigations later, which is totally possible, but it's not within the regulations that you have to show the source. Some jurisdictions make you prove that your money didn't come from the black market. So you have to show them tax returns for your individual investors and things like that. And it's frustrating and challenging. But as far as we know, the state's not going to do that.
Well, I thought I saw on the application, an exhibit under Exhibit P, numbers 4 through 6 that talks about these types of levels of disclosures and documentation. First, you have the documentation establishing that you have the 20,000 liquid assets. But there's number 6 that this says disclosure of all sources of funding used to acquire or develop the craft growers license, right? So, I'm wondering if that is, just like, what is that, right, typically? And so that way our audience can understand what kind of documents they need to furnish for Exhibit P, because it definitely is asking in number 6 on Exhibit P, that level of disclosure. Is it just, what is that exactly?
We had gone through this before, and our assessment was that it wasn't going to be, that it was going to just be the sources as far as like the common language, of the word source, rather than what we normally see. But should the state decide, we've asked the state for clarification on this question and they haven't given it to us. But sources of funding, usually for cannabis, you would provide your tax documents, like maybe your W-2 or your W-4. You can provide things like if your Aunt Elda gave you a trust fund, then information about that trust and how it came to be. If somebody deeded you a piece of property, then that deed instrument, things like that, that just sort of show where that money came from. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for clarifying that. I just want to make sure that, we have some examples so that way people understand, how do they prove this, right? And the right way that the state is asking. So that's great. And again, she's totally right. You need a lot more money. We encourage you to have that financial pro forma, making sure you have enough money to meet that financial pro forma, if not more, right? And then of course, by doing that, if it's, $500,000, it's $750,000, whatever that is, you're already meeting the liquid asset requirements of the state. So, that doesn't even, matter at that point, because no matter what, you are trying to start and operate a successful business here. So you're definitely going to need some capital behind it. So let's move on to like paperwork. This is where a lot of things get, really convoluted, both before and after people get their license. And I think that, it's everything under the sun, from compensation agreements, operating agreements, organizational documents for the business. LP, why don't you go into a little bit of that, so that way our audience can understand more about what the state's asking for.
Yeah, we'll do this briefly. Get a lawyer. Definitely want a lawyer. The number one thing that we recommend at Greenrich Consulting is an operating agreement. The state has asked that if there's one in place that you submit a copy of it. We strongly recommend creating one. It's the overarching document of how you're going to work with your partners and your investors. And anytime there's a dispute or a problem, you go back to that document and you say, this is how we agreed to operate. So it helps keep everyone involved safe. It also tells you, usually the operating agreement will also tell you what's going to happen if things go south. And that's really important to plan in the beginning when everybody's happy and working well together. Make that plan in advance. So get an operating agreement together. If you have a lawyer on your team that's doing all of your paperwork for your contracts and stuff, that's great. I strongly recommend using a different lawyer just for the operating agreement, because you don't necessarily want your business partner, who's also a lawyer, making those decisions for you. Even if you trust them, you know, maybe they can write it and you can have another lawyer take a look at it. But we strongly recommend, having somebody that's looking out after your interests. Take a look at your operating agreement. You're also going to have to do things like file your articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State. You have to do that before submitting your application. That means you have to have a company that legally exists. And then you also have to have your tax ID numbers and things like that. And we learn more about that as you move forward. We strongly also recommend building basic contracts and non-disclosure agreements, which are known as NDAs. Those are very important so that when you're talking to anyone about anything with respect to your company, they're not at liberty to legally disclose the information that you gave them about that company, so they can't steal your idea. Or if they do, you have this document that's signed and dated saying that they won't, and you can use that to sue them. If you get a loan from a person or a company, you're going to need to describe in detail where every penny of money that you got came from. So not necessarily the tax documents and things we were talking about a minute ago, but you can't get a loan from your great aunt Zelda and not disclose her on the application. If she's a lender, you have to name her. If the lenders are companies that are not owned by individual people, but there's shells of companies, a company is owned by another company, is owned by another company, you actually have to disclose all the owners of every company until all that's left are people. So the state really wants to know whose money is coming into play in this instance.
Right, they are truly going deep here too as well. I mean, again, this is all under Exhibit P again, where it talks about anything from compensation agreements to supply agreements to management agreements. Your lawyer can help you assemble all these and make sure it's orchestrated properly. But there's also the fact that if you have an oral agreement with someone in terms of that financial commitment, you have to develop a narrative around that, or term sheet, whatever that looks like, and sign that, because they're requesting that too as well. Because a lot of times you'll find a lot of people saying, yes, we're going to do this, etc. Obviously, it's best practice to ensure you at least get a term sheet so you can nail those terms down. But right there, it discusses this in Exhibit P, that if there's an oral agreement, you have to develop a narrative around it. To be able to submit as handshake
deals need to be disclosed.
Back a napkin deal. So in a supply agreements is a really interesting one too as well. I think that I wonder if I like to throw this question out real quick, LP. Like with supply agreements, like let's just say I have a security vendor and they're going to supply us with all the hardware and surveillance equipment. Is that something that needs to be disclosed in this section?
Yeah. The state wants to know everyone you're working with, everyone you've got contracts with, everyone who you might be participating. If you've made that decision already and there's some sort of agreement, even if it's a handshake, and you say, we're going to hire your security guards, you got to tell the state. And
then supply agreements too would architect agreements, contractor agreements, consulting company agreements, all this fall under and being nested under supply agreements, in your opinion?
In my opinion, yeah. Right now, the way the state is interpreting these things, yes.
Okay. So yeah, I just want to clarify that, because it's like you said earlier, it's like really broad. But when it comes to supply agreements, that's a really, really broad one, right? So if you're putting together a team outside, or an exterior team outside your internal team, that these external subcontractors or third parties, you have a contract with them, you probably want to aggregate and consolidate that, get that in a nice fashion or form that you may have to submit packaged up to the state. So that's really interesting. Thanks for clarifying that, LP.
Zeta, I wanted to clarify, I wanted to add on to that as well. I wanted, in case you're new to this industry, all of this stuff that we're talking about in the application materials is all public record. So all of the people involved, all of these names of team members and investors and lenders, they're all going to be disclosed, and there's no way around that. And the state has made it very clear that there's no way to hide anybody's identity. So if they're concerned about losing their license to practice medicine or something like that, or just concerned about public reaction to them participating in this project, yeah, they may not want to do it.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so just for we're running out of time, so I'd like to move on a little bit to. I know we talked about engagement with the city, and I guess city officials, county officials. Well, what about community? I mean, community is obviously one of the cornerstones of a successful business, right?
Yeah.
You got to be in good, positive alignment with the community's values. The community leaders and stakeholders. And so can you tell us a little bit about how strategically you'd work with a community when you're applying for a license?
Absolutely. There's two different overlapping types of community. So you've got your local community where you want to operate, and you definitely want to get involved there if you aren't already. Make connections, participate, make sure that they know what you're doing and what you're about and why you're there. But then there's also the community of people who are in this space trying to get licensed, trying to create an industry for adult use in Illinois. And that community is also important. And it's sometimes easy to forget that community, they're not your competitors. Yes, everybody's competing for these licenses, everybody's competing for business, but at the end of the day, those are your people, that's your team, and you guys can work together to get the laws changed, to get the city to allow you to do things that they might not otherwise do because you have political power. But also, you never know where your next loan is going to come from, or your next really solid employee. So working together, staying connected, attending events together, keeping in touch with people. Work with existing organizations, especially groups like M4MM, which is minorities for medical marijuana. If you're a POC or other minority, they can help you get organized within your community. But there are tons of groups out there that are nationwide that can provide you some information about what things you can do as groups, because you can get together and develop events where investors come and hear pitches, or you can develop an industry network, or you can develop an industry organization even, because there are so few things available in Illinois right now that your community really has the opportunity to build some great networks.
Right. Yeah. And also, when you're building community or you're building partners or the team or any of that, we want to be careful about using the word partnership. I mean, I know a lot of groups, come out and they are folks, as they're building their team or building, their brand, let's say, or company, they're not even have legal paperwork with someone, and they're calling them their partner, saying we're in partnership with. Can you talk to us a little bit about how to use that term?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a legally defined term in the business world. And when we talk about community, we talk about partnering with organizations and with people, just generally using the general word with the basic meaning. But the law actually defines partner very specifically. And if you call someone your partner and things go south, they can sue you. Right. For part of your company. And there's a really great blog explaining the law around partnership. It's from a law office that's based in California, but the law is very similar everywhere about what partnership means. So really be careful using that word. Use anything else, just not the word partner, unless the person fits strictly within the legal definition of the word partner. Mm-hmm. I put the link to the blog post in the chat window. If you click on the bottom of the chat window, you'll be able to see it. For people who are attending this after the fact, we will make sure that the link is available.
Excellent, thank you, LP. So what else can you provide to compound the value of this this webinar session? I know there's other things that folks in the audience that are applying should be looking for, right? I mean, not just obviously attorneys and other experts and subject matter experts, but what else do you think is important to have at this time right now, as quickly as possible, since we're it's March 16th, it's deadline. Maybe that'll help them be able to fill in some of these team gaps with some of that insight. So what do you think, LP?
Absolutely. Lawyers, like you said, lawyers, get a lawyer that can help you build your company, get a lawyer to write your operating agreement. You need an architect or an engineer. It doesn't have to be an architect, but someone who can develop a layout and floor plan and plot plan and all of those things to scale, which is more difficult than it sounds. So make sure you've got an engineer or a lawyer who's ready and on deck and ready to work with you once you've have your property identified. Other experts that you might not think about right away, a financial expert is so important. They will help you develop your pro forma because you have to submit one to the state. But they will also help keep you out of hot water when it comes to your finances and building your budgets and getting investors excited about your company, because if an investor sees that you have a financial expert on your team, they will actually like talk to you. Other experts that are important are cultivation and or transportation experts. If you're going for an infusion license, you definitely want to have a manufacturing expert on your team. But also things like a realtor that knows cannabis, if that's available to you, that would be great. But even if you can't find a cannabis realtor, finding a local realtor who knows the industry and knows the lay of the land is going to really help you out. And as far as, there's one tip I really wanted to recommend. Everything takes a lot longer than you think it will in this industry. So you need to use your time wisely, but also make sure you have enough of it. This will take you a lot of your time, and you will not see your friends and family for a little while where you're building your team and building your company and submitting your license application for cannabis, or excuse me, for any commercial cannabis entity.
Right now, and speaking of time is something that we're very short on in terms of this application deadline and also this particular webinar session. But I wanted to give a quick shout out to the city of Chicago. We were at the city of Chicago over the weekend and went to, or got invited to, the Cannabis Resource Fair. They did an excellent job. There was at least 4,500 attendees. You know, a lot of excitement out there, a lot of people interested. It's really awesome to see, you know, this in a whole other state besides California, just all across the country, but specifically in Illinois and in Chicago. That was such a great event. We really appreciate, you know, the mayor and everybody else is doing a good job in terms of educating the public and getting things lined up so that way everybody can participate, you know, in this, you know, particular industry. You know, we had a really good excitement and, you know, people wanting to learn more about our Accelerator products. It's helping a lot of folks out there. So for that matter, we are going to be extending our discount currently online that we have on our store. We will be helping more folks through this process. I think that we have one product that's called Application Accelerator Plus that's coming out on the 7th, and then on the 14th, the infuser in transportation will be released too as well. I'm glad we waited because now the secondary FAQs and the update to the application helped us craft the most highest quality product for our customers and any applicants that are actually going through this process, and help speeding that process up. So I wanted to thank all of you for attending our webinar series. We have another one next Thursday, and we'll be talking more about this process and really giving you as many insights as possible. Thank you, LP, for joining us on this session, and best of luck to you guys. See you guys next time.
Thanks, Zeta. I wanted to let you know that there's going to be a poll that will pop up on your screen that will ask you what other webinar topics you'd like to see in the future. So please submit your topics and we will get them to you. We'll listen to you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.